Hi and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video I'm going to talk about compliance with risk-based regulation. And yes, there is a reason for me not to call it risk-based compliance, and that is because we need to look a bit further into risk-based regulation to understand what are we complying with. So risk-based regulation has been evolving through the last 2 decades into becoming a tool that it's being used when regulators want to regulate risk exposure. So not something really tangible, but a certain type of risk in the market. It could be climate change, it could be crime, different type of risk where it is not totally measurable. So when we talk about risk-based regulation, what is specific about this type of regulation is that it needs a risk assessment, and depending on the risk assessment, then the regulation will have certain requirements and demands on the private entities, also member state public governments, on how they need to act to comply with this risk-based regulation. So many people will say that this would be called risk-based compliance, but it's not that easy, because risk-based regulation can be divided into 3 different areas or 3 different types. Hence, this will affect risk-based compliance, because you need to know which one you're talking about before you can actually, comply with it. So we can divide risk-based regulation into 3 specific types: the societal risk-based regulation, the private entity risk-based regulation, and the systemic risk-based regulation. So the way that it is that we know that risk-based regulation is the essence of the aim of it is to allocate resources in the most effective way to mitigate the risk exposure. And this can be seen from a governmental side, from a private institution side, or as a society as a whole, where private and public has to collaborate because it is a systemic risk we are opposed to or confronted with. So how do we do this in a regulatory wise, and how do we comply with it? Because there is a tiny bit of, let's say, an obstacle, and that is that typically when we look at least EU regulation, all 3 types of risk-based regulation will be kind of merged into one regulatory text. That could be, for example, the directives on anti-money laundering, it could be a climate effort, it could be different parts. And the reason why it is merged is because the legal documents, the regulation has to address the public side, the private side, and the collaboration between the parties. So the different type of risk perspective. Is it a private entity that needs to mitigate the risk? Then we have regulation for that, how they should allocate the resources in the most efficient way. Is it a member state? Is it a government? Is it a jurisdiction that needs to do this? Then there's also regulation demanding this. And then there's a collaborative when we're faced with systemic risk, where they need to collaborate. And we can see this is kind of like, if we look at the private compliance with risk-based regulation, when you make a compliance strategy on that type of risk-based regulation, so this is private entity risk-based regulation, what you need to focus on here is the risk that you as a private entity is opposed to, that affects you. It's your risk exposure. And you need to figure out, okay, why is this risk-based regulation? How do they need me to comply with this? Are there certain level of requirements depending on the risk that I'm exposed to? That could be, for example, fraud or something else, like a criminal behavior. Do I have a risk of a cyber attack? Then I need to mitigate the risk by allocating resources to try to close or at least minimize this risk until it is at an acceptable level. This also accounts to the public side, to the societal risk-based regulation. Because when we talk about risk-based regulation and complying with this, there's not really a big difference if you're a private entity or you're a government. because, well, the approach is the same. It's a risk-based approach. It's allocation of resources in the most effective way to mitigate your risk exposure until an acceptable or tolerable level. So the same thing accounts when you talk about member states or governments in this public side of it. Then it's just at a country level. How do you resource allocate? We know it from the health sector. Well, if there's a pandemic going on, maybe we should just postpone some scans or screening of cancer because we need our resources at something else. And that is a priority. So we know this. It is a part of our system. But what differs between the private entity risk-based regulation and the societal risk-based regulation when we talk about the member state allocation of resources, and to the systemic risk-based regulation, that is when their risk exposure affect each other. So this would typically, a good example is always climate, because that affects everyone. So how one allocate its resources will affect the risk exposure of the counterpart. And when we need to make a compliance strategy, this is how we need to divide it up. If you're a private entity, you need to understand that we need to divide our risks into, good, there are private entity risks that are included in the risk-based regulation that we comply with we make a framework for that. But then we also have to make a different compliance exercise and mitigative measures towards the systemic part of this. Because sometimes we forget this systemic compliance, and this is really what risk-based regulation is all about. It is because this tool is used to regulate uncertainty, not just at a small level, but uncertainty in the big scale because of, example given, globalization and our internationalization of transactions and the speed of it, and how we have grown to be interconnected worldwide. So our behavior in one part of the world will affect the other part. This is when it becomes a systemic risk. So we need to divide it up when we want to comply with risk-based regulation. Which type is it that we are opposed to? And typically, if you're a private entity, you would both have private entity risk-based regulation and systemic risk-based regulation that you need to address, but it is two different regulation. It's two different aims that you need to look at. Hence, you need to have that understanding if you want to comply and make a good compliance program. So, just in general, compliance with risk-based regulation, or simply put, risk-based compliance, it demands a risk-based approach and a common understanding on risk tolerance level and acceptance levels of the risk. But when we're talking about the systemic part, it also needs cooperation and transparency between the parties on top of a genuine consensus on risk tolerance and acceptance. So, this was just to try to defragmentize and try to get into a bit more concrete level on that risk-based compliance depends on the type of risk-based regulation that you are opposed to, and you need to understand that before you can make a mitigation plan to actually comply with the type of risk-based regulation. So stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and let's talk much more about compliance.